The frost came early that year in Hollis County, and it came for Verna Ashworth first. She stood at her kitchen window before dawn, watching her breath fog the glass, watching the pasture beyond it turn silver under a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it would snow. 63 years old, 28 of them spent on this land beside a man who was no longer there to share the cold with her. The coffee in her hands had gone lukewarm an hour ago. She hadn't noticed. On the table behind her sat an envelope from First Trust Farmers Bank, opened 3 days ago and read so many times the fold lines had gone soft as cloth. She didn't need to read it again. She knew every word the way she knew the sound of her own front porch settling at night. 90 days. Full satisfaction of the note or the county would take what her grandfather had built with 40 years of his hands. 42 acres, every one of them wrong for growing anything at all. She had known it as a girl running barefoot across ground that broke ankles instead of yielding crops. She had known it as a bride when her husband Everett had laughed and called it the field God forgot to finish. She had known it as a widow alone now, 2 winters staring at soil that gave her nothing but stone. Limestone, not soil. Stone that broke through the earth in ragged gray teeth scattered across every pasture like the bones of something ancient that had died there and never been buried. Rocks the size of a man's skull, boulders the size of a truck bed. A landscape that had defeated 3 generations of Ashworths and was now apparently going to defeat the fourth. The phone rang at 7. She let it go twice before answering because she already knew the voice on the other end. Mrs. Ashworth. Roland Pruitt's voice always carried that particular gentleness bankers used right before they took something from you. I wanted to check in, see how you're doing with the paperwork. I'm doing fine, Roland. I hate this part of my job, Verna. I want you to know that. I've known your family 30 years. Then you know I'm not signing anything yet. A pause, the kind that cost money. The land isn't worth what you owe on it. The soil survey confirms what everyone in this county already knows. 8 inches of topsoil over solid limestone bedrock. No farmer within 100 miles will take on that kind of ground. I'm trying to help you see the numbers clearly so you don't lose more than you have to. She looked out at the pasture again. The rock outcroppings caught the thin morning light and held it the way they always did, cold and patient and utterly indifferent to bank statements. My grandfather worked that field for 40 years, she said. Your grandfather worked in a different economy. He also used to say something about that field. Want to hear it? Roland didn't answer, which she took as permission. He said the land gives you exactly what it wants to give you. Your job isn't to fight it. Your job is to figure out what that is. Verna, with respect, that's a lovely sentiment. It doesn't pay off a mortgage. She hung up before he could say anything else. Her hand was shaking just slightly, and she pressed it flat against the cold window pane until it stopped. That was the morning she decided to go out and count the stones. It made no sense, and she knew it made no sense, and she went anyway. She pulled on her boots, her husband's old canvas coat that still smelled faintly of him. If she pressed her face into the collar just right, and she walked out into the north pasture with a measuring tape and a notebook. Because she needed something to do with her hands that wasn't signing a foreclosure notice, she counted for 3 weeks. Every morning, frost or shine, she walked the property line to property line, tape in hand, marking down sizes, noting clusters, filling page after page of a composition notebook with numbers that meant nothing to anyone but her. The neighbors saw her out there and said nothing to her face. She heard the things they said behind her back anyway. Grief does strange things to a woman alone. That's what people said in town at the feed store in the pews on Sunday. Poor Verna, counting rocks like they're going to save her. She kept counting it. It was during the 2nd week digging through the old equipment barn for a longer tape measure that she found the box. It had been pushed to the back of a shelf behind rusted harness buckles and a coffee can full of nails wrapped in a horse blanket that had gone stiff with age and dust. Cedar by the smell of it once she got the blanket off. Small, maybe the size of a bread box with a brass lock gone green at the edges and no key anywhere she could find. Her grandfather's initials were burned into the lid in shaky, careful letters, E.A. Elias Ashworth. Carved beneath the initials in the same unsteady hand, 4 words. The stones remember boy. She didn't know who boy referred to. Her grandfather had no sons, just her mother, and after her mother, just Verna. She sat on an overturned bucket in that cold barn for a long time, running her thumb over those 4 carved words, feeling something she couldn't name settle into her chest like a held breath. She didn't force the lock. Something in her didn't want to force it. She carried the box into the house instead and set it on the kitchen table next to the foreclosure notice and let the two things sit there together as if they were having a conversation she wasn't yet permitted to hear. That night she called her daughter. Louise picked up on the second ring the sound of Lexington traffic faint behind her voice. "Mom, you okay?" "I found something of your great-grandfather's. A locked box. I can't open it." "Is this about the bank thing?" "Everything's about the bank thing right now." Louise exhaled, and Verna could hear 30 years of a daughter's exhaustion in it. "Mom, I love you, and I need you to hear me. You cannot save that farm by finding an old box in the barn. You need to call the bank back. You need to talk about walking away clean before this destroys you financially for the rest of your life." "Your great-grandmother used to say something," Verna said quietly. "She used to say, 'Don't go looking for what isn't there, go looking for what is.' I think I've spent 30 years looking at this land and seeing what isn't there. Crops that won't grow, money that isn't coming. Maybe it's time I looked at what actually is here." "And what's actually there, Mom? Rocks." Verna looked out the kitchen window at the dark pasture, at the pale shapes of stone just visible under a rising moon. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I intend to find out." She hung up and sat with that box a long while longer before she went to bed. The next morning she made the first of what would become dozens of phone calls. She called every stonework outfit, every masonry company, every landscaping contractor she could find within 50 miles, reading names out of a phone book that was 3 years out of date because nobody in Hollis County had bothered to print a new one. Most numbers didn't even connect. The ones that did connected her to voicemail boxes that never called back or to polite, tired men who told her the same thing in slightly different words. Too remote, too much overhead to extract, not economical. One man laughed before he caught himself and apologized for it. She kept the notebook of stone measurements beside the phone book, and every rejection went into it too. A tally mark beneath the tally marks of boulders and outcroppings until the page looked less like a record of failure and more like a record of a woman refusing to stop. It was Otis Kenner, oddly enough, who gave her the first real lead, though he didn't mean to be helpful when he did it. She'd gone into town for feed for the last of the hens she hadn't yet sold off, and Otis was behind the counter of his store the way he'd been behind that counter for 30 years, weighing out grain with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once had to wonder if he'd keep his land. "Heard you're still out there counting rocks, Verna," he said, not unkindly but not kindly either, just the flat curiosity of a small town watching a woman it had already decided was finished. "I am. My cousin down in Nashville, he does stonework, real fancy stuff, rich folks' houses." Otis snorted, weighing out the last of her order. "Told him about your situation once as a joke. He said even rich men don't pay for rock nobody can get to easy. Said the road into your northern acres would eat a truck suspension alive." "What's his name?" Otis blinked, surprised she'd asked at all. "Cordell, Silas Cordell." "Why, you gonna call him—" "I might." He laughed, and it wasn't cruel exactly, just the laugh of a man who genuinely believed the conversation was over before it started. "Verna, honey, it's rock. It's just rock." She paid for her feed and left without answering him because she had learned in 63 years that some men only heard you when you stopped explaining yourself to them. That night she wrote Silas Cordell a letter, not a phone call this time. A letter the old way, because something in her sensed that a stranger who built beautiful things with his hands might respond better to something built carefully than to a rushed voice on a phone line. She included photographs she'd taken with her late husband's old camera close-ups of the limestone outcroppings, catching the afternoon light the fine grain of the stone visible even in the flat print. She included a copy of the soil survey the bank had used to condemn her land, and she included on a separate sheet everything her grandmother had ever told her about the stone. Her grandmother, Opal, had been raised the daughter of a stonemason before she married into farming, before that trade had gone the way of so many old Kentucky trades, replaced by quarried imports and poured concrete. Opal used to sit on the porch in the evenings and tell young Verna about the old days when a good limestone wall was worth more than the land it sat on, when half the county's finest homes had been raised out of exactly the kind of stone that now lay useless and mocked in the Ashworth pastures. "The land provides what it provides," Opal used to say, rocking in her chair, hands folded over a lap gone soft with age. "Our job is only to see it." Verna wrote that line into the letter to Silas Cordell word for word, and then she sealed the envelope before she could talk herself out of sending it. 3 weeks passed. She had by then begun boxing up the kitchen, not because she'd given up exactly, but because Louise had begged her to be practical, to prepare for the worst, even while hoping for the best. and Verna had found herself standing in front of cabinets full of wedding china wrapping plates and newspaper with hands that moved on their own while her mind stayed somewhere else entirely. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while she had a stack of newspaper in one hand and a soup bowl in the other. Mrs. Ashworth. A man's voice, low, unhurried, with the particular flatness of someone who chose his words the way he'd choose a piece of stone, testing its weight before committing to it. This is Silas Cordell. Got your letter. She set the bowl down very carefully on the counter. Mr. Cordell, I want to see those stones. Her heart did something complicated in her chest, something between hope and the fear of hope, which she had learned over the last 2 years was the more dangerous of the two feelings. When can you come? Saturday, if that works. I'm driving up from Bowling Green. Saturday works. She hung up the phone and stood very still in her half-packed kitchen, surrounded by wrapped dishes and cardboard boxes, and let herself cry for exactly 1 minute, because she had learned that too in the last 2 years, that grief and hope sometimes needed the same amount of water, and it was easier to let both out at once than to try to separate them. Saturday came cold and clear frost, silvering the pasture grass, the kind of Kentucky morning that made the limestone outcroppings glitter faintly, where the sun caught mineral veins buried in the rock. Verna was in the north pasture before Silas Cordell's flatbed truck ever turned up the gravel drive, standing among the stones the way she'd stood there for 3 weeks straight, as if her presence alone might convince them to reveal something. The truck was older than she expected, well kept but well used, the kind of vehicle that had done real work and would keep doing it. The man who climbed out of it was broad through the shoulders, in the particular way of men who'd spent decades lifting things other people couldn't lift with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same material he worked. He wore a canvas jacket the color of dried mud and boots that had clearly walked 100 job sites before this one. Mrs. Ashworth. He nodded, not offering a handshake, yet his eyes already moving past her to the outcroppings scattered across the field. Silas Cordell, mind if I look before we talk? That's why you're here. He walked the pasture slowly, methodically, the way she imagined a doctor might walk toward a patient he wasn't yet sure how to diagnose. He crouched beside the largest outcrop near the fence line, running his palm flat across its surface, and then he did something that surprised her. He pulled a small rock hammer from his jacket pocket and tapped gently along a hairline seam in the stone, listening to the sound it made the way a man might listen to a heartbeat. How old is this fence line? He asked, not looking up. Older than me. My grandfather built it. He used any of the stone in it. Some. Most of what you see, he left where it lay. Said it was easier to farm around than to move. Silas made a low sound in his throat, something between a laugh and a sigh. He stood brushing dust from his knees and walked farther into the field, stopping at 3 more outcroppings, tapping each one, running his hands over the fossil patterns visible in the rock face like a jeweler reading facets in an uncut stone. You know what this is, he said finally. Limestone. That's all anybody's ever called it. It's Ordovician limestone, 450 million years old, give or take. He said it the way another man might say the price of gasoline factual, but there was something underneath the flatness, something that betrayed how much the number actually meant to him. See these patterns here? Those are fossils. Crinoids mostly. Sea creatures, if you can believe that, from back when half of Kentucky was under an ocean. She looked at the pattern. He pointed to a delicate spiral pressed into stone she had walked past 10,000 times without seeing it as anything but an obstacle. It's dense, Silas continued. Fine-grained. The kind that splits clean along its natural seams instead of shattering. You don't get stone like this from a modern quarry, not with this character, not with this weathering pattern already worked into it by 450 million years of exactly nothing happening to it. He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd arrived. Mrs. Ashworth, do you have any idea what I could build with this? Her throat tightened, though she kept her voice steady. Tell me. Walls that'll outlive both of us, foundations, facades for houses that'll stand 500 years without a crack. I've got clients in Nashville, Louisville, even a few in Cincinnati, paying premium money for authentic Kentucky heritage stone, and every single one of them complains about the same thing. New quarry stone doesn't have this. No character, no history in it, nothing but a fresh cut and a factory finish. He pulled a tablet from the truck cab and showed her photographs one after another. Grand homes with weathered stone facades. Curved garden walls with ivy climbing between hand-laid courses. An estate entrance flanked by pillars that looked as if they'd stood since the Revolution. What would you pay? Verna asked, and she heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt. Silas studied the field again, doing arithmetic she couldn't follow, tapping numbers into his phone with a thumb thick as a chisel handle. Depends on volume, depends on quality holding consistent across the property based on what I'm seeing right now, and I'd want to test more of it before I commit to anything firm. I'm looking at maybe 800 tons of recoverable stone across this pasture alone. Current market rate for heritage limestone processed and delivered, I could pay you $35 a ton in extraction rights, maybe more if quality holds. Her mind did the math before he finished speaking. That's $28,000. That's $28,000 for starters. This is a field you work for years. Mrs. Ashworth, not a one-time sale. I'd pay per ton extracted. Steady income for a decade, maybe longer. She felt something crack open in her chest, some seam of hope she'd sealed shut months ago to keep from bleeding out on it. The bank says I have to settle by the end of the year. That's 4 months. Silas went quiet. He looked out across the pasture at the stones scattered like broken teeth across every visible acre, and she watched him think the way she imagined he thought about a wall before he laid the first course. How much do you owe? 82,000. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she heard a hawk cry somewhere over the tree line, heard the wind move through dead grass, heard her own heartbeat in her ears. I could bring a crew in, Silas said finally. Work through the season. If the quality holds consistent the way it's looking right now, I could put together an advance payment against future extraction. But I need to test the stone first. Confirm the grading across the whole property, not just this corner. I'm not going to hand you a number I can't stand behind. How long will that take? A month? Maybe 6 weeks? I have 4. Then we better get started. He shook her hand. Then finally his grip firm and dry and warm despite the cold morning, and something in that handshake felt more binding to her than any contract would later. She watched his truck pull away down the gravel drive, dust rising gold in the afternoon light, and she stood in the north pasture a long while after he'd gone, looking at the stones the way she imagined her grandfather might have looked at them if he'd only had someone tell him what she'd just been told. That evening she sat down at the kitchen table with the locked cedar box. She still couldn't open it. She tried a hairpin, a butter knife, an old skeleton key that fit nothing in the house. The lock held stubborn as the field itself, and she found herself talking to the box, the way lonely people talk to things that can't answer. "You knew something," she said quietly. "Didn't you, Grandpa? You knew what was under all that grass the whole time." The box said nothing back, of course. But she left it on the table that night instead of putting it away, as if its presence there beside the foreclosure notice was itself a kind of answer. Silas Cordell came back 3 days later with sample bags and a rock saw, and for the better part of a week his truck was a fixture in the north pasture, extracting cores from outcroppings across the entire property, labeling each sample with a location number in careful block letters. Verna walked the field with him some days, learning the language of what he was doing, even if she couldn't yet name every fossil or fracture line. Other days she let him work alone and watched from the porch, coffee going cold in her hands, feeling something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Not hope exactly, something quieter than hope. Attention. The sense of being seen finally by someone who looked at her land and saw more than a debt to be settled. It was during that week that Junie Cordell came along for the first time. She was 13 all elbows and curiosity riding shotgun in her father's truck because it was a school holiday and her mother had errands to run. She wandered the field while Silas worked poking at stones with the toe of her sneaker until she found a flat piece Silas had already tested and set aside. "Dad," she called, crouching over it. "Dad, look at this one." Silas glanced over, distracted, still cataloging samples. "What is it, Junebug?" "The pattern. It's not like the others." She traced her finger along a spiral fossil pressed into the surface, more intricate than the ones he'd shown Verna that first day, layered, almost architectural in its symmetry. "It looks like it was built, like somebody designed it." Silas walked over, crouched beside his daughter, and went quiet in a way Verna had already learned meant something important was happening. "That's not just a crinoid stem," he murmured almost to himself. "That's a full colony fossil, multiple organisms preserved together, still holding their structure after all this time." He looked up at Verna, something sharpened in his expression that hadn't been there before. "Mrs. Ashworth, I need to walk the rest of this property again, all of it, every acre." "I thought you already tested the field." "I tested what I could see from the road and the near pastures. If this quality is consistent across all 42 acres, and if there are more formations like this one buried under ground cover we haven't cleared yet." He stopped himself, shook his head slightly, as if reining in an excitement he didn't want to show her too plainly before the numbers backed it up. "I need another 2 weeks." "I don't have 2 weeks to spare, Mr. Cordell." "I know." He looked at his daughter, who was still crouched over the fossil, running her fingers along its ridges with the reverence other children reserved for toys. "But if I'm right about what's under this ground, Mrs. Ashworth, 2 weeks is nothing compared to what we'd be leaving on the table by rushing it. Junie looked up at Verna with the plain, unguarded honesty only a 13-year-old could manage. It's like archaeology, she said. Every stone has history in it. My dad sees that. Not everybody does. She paused. Do you... Verna looked out across the pasture at ground she had cursed and buried and nearly surrendered, and felt the question settle into her the way seeds settle into soil that has finally, after decades, been prepared to receive them. I'm starting to, she said. The following week brought Otis Kenner's mockery back into her life in full force because word of Silas Cordell's truck parked in the Ashworth pasture had inevitably made its way into town. She heard about it secondhand, first from a neighbor who mentioned it at church with poorly hidden amusement, and then she heard it directly standing in line at the feed store while Otis weighed out grain for the man ahead of her. Heard you got some rock buyer poking around your place, Verna, Otis said, not quite looking at her, addressing the room more than her specifically. What's he going to do, build himself a pyramid? Laughter rippled from a man near the seed display. Verna felt her face go hot, but she kept her spine straight the way her grandmother had taught her, the way Opal used to say, a woman's back was the one thing nobody could take from her if she didn't let them. He's going to pay for the stone, she said evenly. Otis's smile faltered just slightly, uncertain now whether he was still telling a joke or being told something he hadn't expected. Verna, honey. His voice went soft in that particular pitying way she had grown to hate more than outright cruelty. Those rocks aren't worth nothing. I think you're getting yourself scammed by some fast talker out of Bowling Green. We'll see, she said, and paid for her feed, and left without giving him the satisfaction of an argument. But the words followed her home anyway, the way unkind words always did, settling into her chest alongside the foreclosure notice and the locked cedar box. 3 separate weights she carried up the porch steps that evening, feeling for the first time in weeks the true size of what she'd risk if Silas Cordell turned out to be wrong. The bank called that same week, Roland Pruitt's voice gentler than ever, which somehow made it worse. We need a decision, Verna. The foreclosure clock is running, and I can't hold it off indefinitely, not even for you. I'm working on something, Roland. What kind of something? The kind that isn't your business yet. She hung up before her voice could betray how much she was gambling on a stranger's truck and a 13-year-old girl's sharp eyes. Silas Cordell returned in July, this time with a folder of paperwork instead of just sample bags, and a second man beside him. She hadn't met an architect out of Louisville named Marcus Delaney, tall and quiet, who walked the property with the unhurried attention of a man evaluating something far more valuable than rock. Every sample came back grade A or better, Silas told her, standing in her kitchen with the folder open on the table beside the locked cedar box, which she still hadn't managed to open and had simply stopped trying to hide from visitors. 17 locations across the property, consistent density, consistent fossil preservation, minimal weathering damage. Mrs. Ashworth, I don't think you understand what you're sitting on. Then explain it to me plainly. You've got one of the finest deposits of heritage-grade limestone I've seen in 15 years of doing this work. Not just good stone, rare stone, the kind institutions pay a premium for. He glanced at Marcus, who nodded once in confirmation. I want to bring you a real offer, not just extraction rights on a handshake. A contract and advance payment structured against a 5-year extraction plan. How much of an advance? Silas didn't answer right away, and she watched him do the math again, slower this time, more carefully, the way a man calculates when he knows the answer will change someone's life. $87,000, he said finally. It's a gamble on my end, Mrs. Ashworth. I'm betting the quality holds and the market stays strong for 5 years, but I've seen enough now to make that bet. The number hit her like a held breath finally released. 82,000 owed, 87 offered, $5,000 of daylight between ruin and survival. I need to read the contract, she said, her voice steadier than her hands. And I need my daughter to see it too. Take all the time you need, I'm not going anywhere. Louise drove down from Lexington that weekend with a lawyer friend in tow, and the two of them spread papers across the same kitchen table, where Roland Pruitt had once told her to give up working through clauses and terms, with the careful suspicion of people who had seen too many good deals turn bad in the fine print. Verna sat across from them, hands folded, watching her daughter's face for any flicker of doubt. Mom, Louise said finally, looking up from the contract, something shifting in her expression that Verna hadn't seen there in 2 years. This is real. This is legitimate. The stones, Verna said quietly, and found that her eyes had filled without her quite noticing. Your great-great-grandmother always said they were a gift, just waiting for someone to see their value. Louise reached across the table and took her mother's hand, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all because some moments don't need narration, only witness. Verna signed the contract on the 4th of August at that same kitchen table with the locked cedar box sitting silent beside the papers as if it too were watching. Silas handed her the check with both hands, the way a man hands over something he understands the weight of. "This clears the bank," he asked, with a little to spare. "With 5,000 to spare," she said, and found she couldn't quite make her voice work above a whisper. "Good. My crew starts next week." She held the check a long moment after he'd gone, feeling not the paper itself, but everything it represented. The land had stayed. The stones finally, after 450 million years of silence, had been seen. The morning she walked into First Trust Farmers Bank was cold and bright frost still silvering the courthouse lawn across the street, and she wore her work clothes because she saw no reason to dress up for a man who had already decided months ago that she wasn't worth his patience. Roland Pruitt was in his office preparing the final foreclosure paperwork when his secretary called him to the front desk, her voice carrying an uncertainty that made two other tellers look up from their stations. "Roland, Verna Ashworth is here." He came out slowly, and she watched his eyes travel from her mud-flecked boots up to the cashier's check in her hand, watched the exact moment his professional composure cracked into something closer to disbelief. "That's—" He stopped himself, took the check from her hand, turned it over, as if expecting to find some trick in the paper itself. Business account, Bowling Green address. Real, legitimate. "Verna, where did you—" He caught himself a second time. What is this $87,000, she said, and her voice came out clear and even, carrying farther in that quiet bank lobby than she intended. "To clear the loan in full with closing costs." "What is this money for?" "Payment for the stones, Roland. The ones you told me made my land worthless." Behind her, Otis Kenner had come in to deposit his store's payroll, and she heard him go very still, heard the particular silence of a man realizing he'd laughed at the wrong thing. By noon, half the county knew. Silas Cordell's crew arrived the following Monday, 4 men and equipment Verna had never seen on farmland in her life. Hydraulic splitters, diamond blade saws, a small excavator modified for careful stone extraction rather than blunt destruction. They set up a processing area near the road in the northeast corner where the outcroppings ran thickest, and Verna stood at the fence line the first morning and watched them work with something like awe. They didn't blast, they didn't break, they found the natural seams her grandfather's ground had held for 450 million years, and they split along the grain, lifting out blocks that weighed hundreds of pounds clean and whole and intact, the way a jeweler might lift a stone from its setting without disturbing a single facet. "The fossils are incredible," Silas told her one afternoon, holding up a piece with ancient spiral shapes fossilized in perfect layered patterns. "This one's going to a restoration project in Cincinnati. Historic mansion foundation built in the 1840s. This stone matches the original construction almost perfectly." She held the piece in both hands, feeling its cold, dense weight, and thought of her grandfather dead now, 30 years, who had walked this same ground and known somehow, without ever having the words for it, that the field he'd cursed was also the field that would one day save his family. By September, the first shipment left the farm. 12 tons of cut and processed limestone bound for Nashville on the back of a flatbed truck that rumbled down the gravel drive at dawn, leaving dust-hanging gold in the morning light behind it. Verna received her first check beyond the advance that same week, $420. Small compared to the $87,000, but different in kind, because this was money the land itself had earned, not a loan against its future. She sat at her kitchen table with the check in one hand and the locked cedar box in the other, and for the first time since she'd found it, she thought she understood at least a little what her grandfather might have meant. Louise came down that weekend, walked to the extraction site with her mother, saw the organized crew, the careful work, the stones stacked by grade near the road, waiting for transport. "Mom," she said, standing at the edge of the pasture, watching the last light of the day catch the cut stone and turn it gold. "Do you know what you've done? I kept the farm. You've done more than that. You've found value everyone said didn't exist." Verna looked out across the field at ground that had been dismissed by a banker, mocked by a neighbor, abandoned by 3 generations of farmers who could see nothing in it but failure, and felt something settle into her chest that she hadn't felt in the 2 long years since Everett had passed. Not triumph exactly, something quieter and steadier and far more durable than triumph. "The land did it," she said softly. "I just finally learned how to look at it." That night, after Louise had driven back to Lexington, and the crew's equipment sat silent and dark near the road. Verna sat alone at her kitchen table with the cedar box in front of her, running her thumb once more over her grandfather's carved words. The stones remember boy. She still didn't know who the boy had been meant for, or what exactly the box contained, or why he'd locked it so carefully and left it buried behind old harness leather in a barn nobody had cleaned out in decades. But she had begun for the first time to suspect that whatever was inside that box had been waiting for her specifically all this time, the way the stones themselves had waited 450 million years for someone to finally see what they were worth. She banked the fire low, set the box on the shelf above the mantel where she could see it every morning, and went to bed with the sound of her grandmother's voice still moving through her thoughts like water over stone. The land provides what it provides. Our job is only to see it. Outside, the first frost of the season settled over 42 acres of limestone that had at last, after 4 generations of Ashworths, begun to give something back. October arrived in Hollis County the way it always did, quietly at first, then all at once, frost deepening on the pastures each morning until the grass itself seemed to hold its breath before noon. Verna Ashworth had grown used to the sound of Silas Cordell's crew by then. The low grind of the diamond saw the hydraulic hiss of the splitter finding its seam, the particular rhythm of men who respected what they were taking from the ground instead of tearing it free. She had stopped flinching at the noise weeks ago. Now it sounded some mornings almost like music. The co-op meeting fell on the second Tuesday of the month, same as it had for as long as she could remember, held in the low brick building off Route 9, where 3 generations of Hollis County farmers had argued over grain prices and fence disputes, and this particular autumn over her. She almost didn't go. Louise had called the night before to ask if she wanted company, and Verna had told her no, because some battles a woman needed to walk into alone, the same way she'd walked into the North Pasture alone 3 weeks running with nothing but a measuring tape and a stubborn refusal to disappear quietly. She sat 3 rows back, coat still buttoned against the chill outside, and listened to Wendell Ash open the meeting with the same dry efficiency he brought to every gathering, moving through old business toward the budget discussion for next year's grain subsidies. It was Garrett Voss who stood first, and something in the set of his shoulders told her this had been coming for a while. He farmed 300 acres of corn and soybeans on the far side of the county, had sat on every agricultural board Hollis County maintained, and carried himself with the particular authority of a man who believed without ever quite saying so that real farming meant exactly what he did and nothing else. "I want to talk about responsible land use," he said, not looking at her, addressing the room. Instead, the way men often did when the thing they meant to say was aimed at one person, but easier delivered as a general principle. "We've got people in this county treating farmland like a rock quarry, digging up fields instead of planting them. That's not agriculture, that's mining." A murmur moved through the room, low, uncertain, the kind of sound a crowd makes when it isn't sure yet which way to lean. 42 acres that could be in production are sitting idle," Garrett continued, "while some out-of-town contractor strips the topsoil for profit. I think it's fair to ask whether that serves this community." Verna felt every eye in the room find her, felt the old weight of dismissal settle back onto her shoulders, dressed up now in newer language than the banker had used, but no lighter for the dressing. Wendell Ash cleared his throat. "Garrett raises a fair point about land use." He hesitated, glanced toward her with something that might have been apology. "Verna, would you like to respond?" She stood. Her grandmother had taught her a long time ago that a woman didn't argue for the sake of arguing, but Opal had also taught her that silence offered at the wrong moment was its own kind of surrender. "That land couldn't feed one family," Verna said, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. "I tried for 20 years. The stone-to-soil ratio made it useless for crops, and every man in this room who's driven past my North Pasture knows that better than I do. But the stone itself is building homes that will stand for centuries. It's put 4 men to full-time work. It's kept my farm out of foreclosure, and it's kept me in this county, in this church, at this meeting instead of packing a moving truck for Lexington." "But you're not farming," Garrett said. And there was something almost wounded beneath the challenge in his voice, though she couldn't yet name what it was. "I'm doing what the land is good for," Verna answered. "Isn't that what farmers do? Work with what we have, not what we wish we had." The room went quiet in a way that felt to her like the held silence right before a stone gives way along its seam. It was Nora Fentress who broke it, standing near the back where she'd been listening with her arms crossed, her voice carrying the easy confidence of a woman who ran her own organic operation on the east side of the county and had spent years defending her own choices against similar rooms. "My grandfather always said Kentucky was built on 3 things," Nora said. Tobacco horses and limestone. Maybe Verna's just remembering that better than the rest of us. A few people laughed quietly, and something in the room's temperature shifted. Not entirely, not enough to call it resolved, but enough that the meeting moved on to grain subsidies. Without further comment, Verna sat back down with her hands folded in her lap, feeling the particular exhaustion that came from being seen and judged in the same breath and telling herself it was a smaller cost than losing the farm outright. But Garrett Voss caught her in the parking lot afterward anyway, his truck idling behind him, his breath visible in the cold evening air. "You think you're clever," he said low, not performing for a room this time. "But you're making real farmers look bad, making the rest of us look like we don't know how to use our own land." Verna met his eyes, and something in his face, some tightness around the jaw, some old grief she couldn't yet place, made her hold her tongue a moment longer than her first instinct wanted. "Maybe you don't know how to use land like mine," she said finally. "But I do now." She drove home, past fields going still for winter, past a county that had spent 2 years deciding she was finished and was only just beginning to reconsider, and she told herself all the way up her own gravel drive that Garrett Voss's anger belonged to something older than her stones, even if she didn't yet understand what it was. The operation grew through the last weeks of autumn, the way Silas had promised it would. A second architect called from Louisville. Then a third client from Cincinnati, word of Hollis County limestone moving through circles Verna had never imagined her land might reach. She watched the crew work each morning with something like pride now, instead of disbelief. Watched Silas train a new hand on the hydraulic splitter. Watched Junie Cordell come along on weekends to catalog fossil patterns in a notebook, not unlike the one Verna herself had filled with stone measurements months before. It was in the second week of November, just as the operation seemed to be finding its rhythm, that the first real trouble arrived, and it did not arrive the way Verna expected trouble to arrive. It came quietly in a phone call from Silas that carried none of his usual steadiness. "Mrs. Ashworth, I need to come by." "Is something wrong?" "The Cincinnati shipment, the restoration project." A pause, the kind that costs something to hold. "They rejected it." He arrived within the hour, and she watched him climb out of his truck, moving slower than he had all season, a folder under his arm that he set on her kitchen table with the same careful weight he used for the finest stone samples, as if the bad news itself deserved handling. 12 tons, he said. Cut graded, delivered on schedule. The site engineer flagged surface weathering inconsistent with the historic stone they're matching. Said the color variation was too pronounced, said it wouldn't blend with the original 1840s construction the way they needed it to. Is he right? Silas exhaled slowly, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something like real worry cross his face. "Some of it, maybe. There's a section of the quarry we opened up near the tree line that's been more exposed to groundwater over the centuries. More iron staining than the samples I originally tested. I should have caught it before the shipment went out. That's on me." "What does this cost us?" "The client's asking for a full refund on that shipment, plus damages for the delay to their restoration timeline. That's close to $40,000, Mrs. Ashworth. And if word gets out that a shipment got rejected on quality, other clients start asking questions. Marcus Delaney's contract, the one that's supposed to keep this operation running for years, that's built on trust in our grading process." She sat down slowly across from him, the same chair she'd sat in the night Louise and her lawyer friend had spread contracts across this same table, and felt the particular vertigo of watching solid ground reveal itself once again as something less solid than it had seemed. "Can we fix it? We can resurvey the whole property. Grade every section properly this time, not just the 17 test locations I sampled back in the summer. But that costs money we don't have right now, and it costs time we don't have either. Marcus needs 200 tons over 18 months. If we can't guarantee consistent quality across that volume, he walks, and he tells every architect in Louisville why." Verna looked past him out the kitchen window at the pasture where 4 men had spent the autumn pulling 450-million-year-old stone from ground. Her grandfather had cursed and felt the cold, familiar shape of fear settling back into her chest. The same fear she'd carried the morning Roland Pruitt first called about foreclosure. "What do you need from me, Silas?" "Time, and trust that I can fix what I got wrong." He rubbed a hand over his jaw, and for a moment he looked less like the confident man who'd walked her field in August, and more like someone standing at the edge of his own uncertain ground. "I won't lie to you about how bad this could get if I can't." She thought of the $87,000 that had cleared her debt. She thought of the $420 check that had felt at the time like proof the land itself could provide. She thought of her grandfather's cedar box sitting on the mantel, its 4 carved words watching over every decision she'd made since finding it. "Then fix it," she said. "And Silas, next time something goes wrong, you tell me the day it happens, not after you've already tried to solve it alone." He held her gaze a long moment, something passing between them that felt less like a business arrangement now and more like the kind of trust two people build when they've already survived one crisis together. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "I will." The resurvey took 11 days, and Verna spent every one of them the way she'd spent the 3 weeks counting stones back in the spring, walking the property alongside Silas and his crew, watching them mark sections for iron content testing samples from ground they hadn't touched before, learning to read weathering patterns the way she'd once learned to read weather itself from the color of the western sky. It was during that survey on a gray afternoon, with sleet threatening and low clouds overhead, that Silas found something in the northeast corner that stopped him mid-step. Mrs. Ashworth, his voice had gone strange, tight in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "Come look at this." She crossed the frozen grass to where he crouched beside a section of exposed bedrock near the property's eastern fence line, an area they'd cleared of brush only that morning. Cut into the stone, faint but unmistakable, were markings that didn't belong to nature at all. Straight lines, measured intervals, the unmistakable evidence of a hand tool applied decades ago, mapping something with deliberate care. "Somebody's been in here before us," Silas said quietly. "A long time before us." Verna crouched beside him, running her fingers over the shallow grooves, feeling something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the November chill. "My grandfather," she said. "It has to be." He knew what this stone was. She thought of the cedar box on her mantel, its lock still stubbornly closed, its 4 carved words watching over a kitchen table that had seen a foreclosure notice and a check for $87,000, and now apparently evidence that Elias Ashworth had known something about this land that he'd never told a single living soul. "I think he might have," she said slowly. "I think he might have known for a very long time." That evening she sat alone with the cedar box, again turning it over in her hands beneath the kitchen light, tracing the carved letters until her fingers ached from the pressure of pressing against something that refused to open. The stones, remember, boy. She still didn't know who the boy had been. She was beginning to wonder if the answer to that question was buried somewhere beneath the very ground Silas Cordell's crew was carefully, patiently taking apart. The resurvey ultimately confirmed what Silas had suspected. The iron staining was isolated to a narrow band near the old tree line, easily mapped and easily avoided going forward. The rest of the property, all 42 acres of it, graded out exactly as consistent and exactly as valuable as the original 17 test locations had promised back in the summer. Silas personally drove the refund check to Cincinnati, absorbed the cost of the rejected shipment out of his own margins, rather than passing any of it back to Verna, and returned 3 days later with a revised extraction map that avoided the compromised section entirely. "I told Marcus Delaney everything," he said, standing in her kitchen with mud still on his boots, the crisis apparently behind them. Now, though, something in his posture told her he hadn't yet fully forgiven himself for the oversight. Told him about the rejected shipment, told him what caused it, told him exactly how we fixed it and what we're doing differently going forward. What did he say? He said he'd rather work with a contractor who tells him the truth about a problem than one who hides it until it's too late to fix. Silas allowed himself for the first time in almost 2 weeks something close to a real smile. "Contract's still on. 200 tons, 18 months, same terms as before." Relief moved through her like warmth returning to cold hands, and she found herself, for just a moment, laughing quietly at her own kitchen table, the particular laughter of someone who has just stepped back from a ledge she hadn't fully realized she was standing on. But relief, she was learning that winter rarely arrived alone in Hollis County. It came instead paired with its opposite waiting just behind the door. The letter from the Hollis County Planning Commission arrived the first week of December, official and cold in a way that immediately reminded her of Roland Pruitt's foreclosure notice 10 months before. Unregulated commercial extraction operations on agricultural land, a hearing scheduled for the second Tuesday of the month. Attendance required. She drove to the courthouse that morning with a knot in her stomach that felt disturbingly familiar, and found Silas already there in the hallway outside the hearing room, paperwork organized in a leather folder he held against his chest like a man bracing for weather. "They want to shut us down," he said quietly before she'd even finished crossing the hall toward him. Say, we need mining permits, environmental review, the whole regulatory process, retroactively applied to everything we've done since August. Can they do that? They can try. Whether they succeed depends on whether our paperwork holds up. He opened the folder briefly, showed her a stack of documents thick enough to make her understand for the first time just how much he'd already anticipated a moment like this one. State Department of Natural Resources permits, environmental clearance, business licenses, insurance documentation. Everything filed the day we started Mrs. Ashworth, because I've watched operations like this get shut down before by people who assumed nobody would ask to see the paperwork. Then why does this feel like they're already planning to shut us down anyway? Silas's jaw tightened. Because somebody filed a formal complaint, anonymous, and I don't think it's about permits at all. The hearing room was packed by the time they entered, more people than Verna had seen at a county meeting in years, farmers and neighbors, and near the front, unmistakably Garrett Voss, sitting with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed straight ahead. Dabney Wexler, chairman of the Planning Commission, called the hearing to order from behind a raised bench that suddenly made Verna feel very small in her own county courthouse. We've received concerns about commercial extraction operations occurring on agricultural land within county limits, Wexler said, reading from prepared notes. Mrs. Ashworth, can you explain what's currently taking place on your property? Verna stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the room settle onto her, the way it had at the co-op meeting, except heavier now, official now, carrying the particular menace of government process instead of mere neighborhood gossip. I'm selling fieldstone, she said, her voice carrying farther than she expected in the hushed room. The same way farmers in this county have always sold timber rights or mineral rights or anything else their land happened to produce that wasn't a crop in the ground. The stone was always there. I simply found someone willing to recognize its value. But you're operating what amounts to a commercial quarry, Wexler pressed. That requires a different regulatory framework than traditional agriculture. I'm extracting surface stone from my own property, Verna answered. No blasting, no deep mining, nothing but removing what's been sitting on top of this ground for 10,000 years in a manner Mr. Cordell has documented and permitted through every state agency that governs it. Silas stood, then opening his folder, walking it forward to hand up to the bench with the calm precision of a man who had done exactly this kind of preparation before, precisely because he'd anticipated exactly this kind of challenge. Chairman Wexler, everything is documented, he said. State Department of Natural Resources extraction permit filed and approved in July. Environmental impact clearance filed the same month. Business licensing, insurance, workers' compensation coverage for all 4 crew members. I'd ask the Commission to review the full record before determining that this operation requires anything beyond what's already been filed. Wexler took the folder, flipped through it with visibly growing surprise, passed pages to the commissioners seated beside him, who exchanged glances that told Verna, even from where she stood, that they had expected resistance and found compliance instead. We'll need time to review this properly, Wexler said finally, his voice carrying less certainty than it had at the start of the hearing. This matter is continued pending full commission review. Outside afterward in the cold parking lot with sleet finally beginning to fall in earnest, Garrett Voss caught up to her once more, though his voice this time carried less confidence than it had at the co-op meeting weeks before. You think this is over, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I think the paperwork speaks for itself, Garrett. He looked at her a long moment, something working behind his eyes that she still couldn't name, and then he turned and walked to his truck without another word, leaving her standing in the sleet beside Silas, both of them watching him go. That complaint didn't come from him, Silas said quietly once Garrett's truck had pulled out of the lot. How do you know? Because I know men like Garrett Voss. If he wanted to shut us down, he'd have stood up in that hearing room and said so to my face. Anonymous complaints come from people who don't want their name attached to what they're trying to do. Silas's expression had gone hard in a way she hadn't seen from him before. I think somebody wants this operation to fail badly enough to hide behind a form letter to do it, and I don't think that somebody lives in Hollis County at all. She thought of Marcus Delaney's contract, 200 tons over 18 months, the largest and most lucrative agreement the operation had yet secured, and felt a cold suspicion begin to form that had nothing to do with the sleet now falling steadily around them. Who would benefit from us losing that contract, Silas? I don't know yet. He looked toward his truck, toward the folder of permits, now safely returned to his possession, toward the courthouse behind them, where a decision that could end everything they'd built sat now in the hands of a commission that had, at least for the moment, been given no legal reason to say no. But I intend to find out before this hearing reconvenes. They drove their separate ways home through sleet turning slowly to snow, and Verna spent that night at her kitchen table once more, the cedar box beside her, the planning commission's letter beside that, and felt for the first time since signing Silas Cordell's contract in August, the particular fear of a woman who has finally built something worth losing. The days following the hearing brought a strange quiet to Hollis County, the kind of quiet that Verna had learned over 63 years of living through Kentucky winters usually meant something was gathering strength just out of sight. Silas called twice that week, each time with fragments of information rather than answers. A call to the state permitting office confirmed no other complaints had been filed against similar operations elsewhere in the region that season. A conversation with an old colleague in the Nashville stone trade surfaced a rumor unconfirmed about a larger quarrying company out of Ohio that had recently lost a bid on a Louisville restoration contract to an independent Kentucky operation matching Marcus Delaney's description almost exactly. "It's not proof," Silas told her over the phone, his voice carrying the particular frustration of a man circling an answer he couldn't yet grasp firmly enough to hold. "But it's the first thing that's made sense since that complaint landed." Verna, meanwhile, found herself returning again and again to the cedar box on her mantel, and to the tool marks Silas's crew had uncovered near the eastern fence line, the two mysteries braiding together in her mind until she could no longer think of one without the other. Her grandfather had known something about this land. He had marked it decades ago with the same care Silas now brought to his own surveys, and he had locked away whatever he'd learned behind a brass lock and 4 carved words that made less sense with every day she failed to open it. She called a locksmith in Bowling Green the second week of December, an elderly man named Fitch, who'd been recommended by the church secretary as someone who dealt in old and difficult mechanisms. He came out on a Thursday, examined the lock under a jeweler's loupe for the better part of 20 minutes, and finally set the box down on her kitchen table with something like reluctant respect in his expression. "This isn't a lock somebody wants opened easily, Mrs. Ashworth," he said. "Whoever built this knew what they were doing. I can force it, but forcing a lock this old risks damaging whatever's inside it. Can you open it without forcing it? Given time, maybe. This kind of mechanism, sometimes the answer isn't in the lock at all. Sometimes it's in a key that's been hidden somewhere else entirely, and the lock's just waiting for somebody to find it." He left without opening it, but his words settled into her the way certain sentences did, staying long after the man himself had driven off down her gravel drive, somewhere hidden entirely. She thought of the tool marks in the northeast corner. She thought of her grandfather walking this land for 40 years, marking it, measuring it, understanding something about it that he had never once spoken aloud to anyone, not even apparently to the daughter who became Verna's mother. She began searching the property in earnest that week between snow flurries, walking ground she thought she'd already walked 100 times that year, looking now not for stone valuable enough to sell, but for whatever her grandfather might have hidden to match a lock he'd carved with such deliberate warning. She found nothing in the barn beyond what she'd already uncovered, nothing in the old equipment shed, nothing beneath the floorboards of the tool shed her grandfather had built with his own hands sometime in the 1950s. She was beginning to wonder if the key, whatever it was, had been lost to time, entirely buried under decades of neglect, and a family that had simply stopped asking questions about a field nobody believed was worth questioning. It was Junie Cordell, once again, who found the thread nobody else had thought to pull. She'd come along with her father on a Saturday in mid-December, the extraction crew idle for the week, while the planning commission deliberated, and had wandered into the old equipment barn out of simple 13-year-old boredom, the same barn where Verna had first found the cedar box months before. "Mrs. Ashworth," Junie called out, her voice carrying an edge of excitement that made Verna's pulse quicken before she'd even crossed the barn floor. "There's writing on the back of the shelf, real faint, I almost didn't see it." Verna crouched beside the girl, angling her flashlight against the weathered wood, where the cedar box had sat hidden behind a horse blanket for who knew how many years. They're carved into the underside of the shelf itself in the same shaky, deliberate hand as the box's lid were. More words, fainter, harder to read, but unmistakably her grandfather's. "Ask the stone that watches the water, that watches." She read it 3 times before the meaning began to settle, and when it did, she felt something cold and electric move up her spine. "The spring," she whispered. "The old spring house down by the creek." She hadn't been to the spring house in years, a small stone structure her grandfather had built over a natural spring near the property's southern boundary, long since abandoned once the county ran water lines out that far in the 70s. She and Junie walked down together, boots crunching through thin snow, and found the little structure still standing moss-grown and half-collapsed at one corner, but intact enough that its interior remained dry. And there set into the stone wall above the spring's shallow basin, half hidden by decades of dust and cobweb, was a small iron key tied with a length of leather cord, gone brittle with age, hanging exactly where a man might leave something he intended one specific person someday to find. Verna held it in her palm a long moment before she could bring herself to close her fingers around it, feeling the weight of 40 years of silence pressing down through one small piece of rusted metal. "Do you think it fits?" Junie asked quietly, watching her with the wide, patient eyes of a girl who understood somehow that she was witnessing something that belonged to someone else's family history and deserved to be treated with care. "I think," Verna said slowly, "we're about to find out." They walked back to the house together through the thickening snow, and Verna set the key on the kitchen table beside the cedar box, and for a long moment simply looked at the two objects together, 40 years of waiting compressed into the small distance between them. She didn't open it that afternoon. Some part of her understood that whatever her grandfather had locked away deserved to be opened alone in her own time, without an audience, without even the kindness of a 13-year-old girl's excited company. She thanked Junie, walked her out to Silas's truck, and stood on her porch watching them drive away down the gravel road as the last gray light of the December afternoon faded toward evening. Then she went back inside, sat down at her kitchen table, and lifted the small iron key toward the lock that had waited patient as the limestone itself for 40 years to be answered. The Planning Commission's decision arrived by mail 3 days before Christmas, a single official letter that Verna opened standing in her own kitchen, with her coat still on, snow melting off her boots onto the floor. She hadn't yet found time to mop that morning. She read it once, quickly, then again more slowly, letting the language settle into something she could actually believe. Permits confirmed valid, no further regulatory action required, operation cleared to continue. She sat down hard in the nearest chair, relief moving through her so completely that for a moment she couldn't quite catch her breath. And then she reached for the phone to call Silas, because some news she'd learned this year needed to be shared the moment it arrived, not held alone even for the length of time it took to finish removing a coat. But the key sat waiting on the table in front of her the entire time she made that call, and long after she'd hung up, and long after the last of the December light had faded from her kitchen window, because some mystery she was learning took longer to resolve than a single afternoon, no matter how much a woman's hands trembled to finally know the answer. The key turned on the third try, not because it resisted, but because Verna's hands would not stop trembling long enough to align it properly with the mechanism. When the lock finally gave, the small click it made in the quiet kitchen seemed to her louder than anything she had heard all year, louder than the diamond saw, louder than the bank's foreclosure. Notice louder, even than her own heartbeat, which had been climbing steadily since she first felt that key close her fingers around it at the spring house 3 days before. She lifted the lid slowly, the cedar hinges stiff with 40 years of disuse, and for a moment simply stared at what lay inside before she trusted herself to touch any of it. Papers first, folded tightly yellowed at the edges, tied with the same kind of leather cord that had held the key. Beneath them, a hand-drawn map ink faded to sepia, showing the property in her grandfather's careful, deliberate script, every acre marked and measured the way she had once marked and measured it herself with a cheap measuring tape and a composition notebook. And beneath the map, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth, a single piece of stone no larger than her palm, polished smooth on one face, revealing a fossil pattern so intricate and so perfectly preserved that she understood immediately why a man might have hidden it away, rather than risk anyone else laying claim to it. She unfolded the papers, first her breath fogging faintly in the cool kitchen air, and began to read her grandfather's handwriting for what felt like the first time in her life. Though she had grown up beside the same man, had eaten breakfast across from him for 18 years before he passed. The letter was dated 1961, addressed simply to whoever finds this. "I walked this field for 40 years knowing what it held," her grandfather had written, "and I told no one because I watched a man lose everything the year I was young, trying to sell stone to buyers who cheated him. Blind, took his rock for nothing and sold it downstate for a fortune he never saw a dime of. I decided then I would rather farm bad ground honestly than trust good stone to men who'd steal it from under me. I marked what I found. I hid what I knew. I told myself someday when the right person came looking with the right kind of patience, the land would show them what I already understood. I did not know it would be my own granddaughter who would need it most. But if you are reading this, girl, then the stones have finally found their moment. and I am sorry I could not be there to see it with you." She read it 3 times before the words fully settled, and when they did, she found herself crying in a way she hadn't allowed herself since the week after Everett's funeral, quiet and complete, her forehead nearly touching the kitchen table, her hand still resting on her grandfather's map, as though she might somehow feel him through the paper itself. Her grandfather had known, not merely suspected, not merely hoped, but known with the same certainty Silas Cordell had carried into that first walk of the North Pasture, that the ground beneath the Ashworth farm held something far more valuable than any crop could ever provide. He had known, and he had chosen silence over risk, protection over profit, because somewhere in his own younger years, he had watched greed and dishonesty strip a neighbor bare, and had decided his family's stone would rather stay buried forever than be stolen out from under them by men who saw only dollars where he had learned slowly and privately to see history. She thought of Otis Kenner's laughter in the feed store. She thought of Roland Pruitt's gentle, condescending certainty that her land was worthless. She thought of Garrett Voss standing in the co-op meeting insisting she wasn't a real farmer, and felt something shift inside her. Not quite anger, but a fierce and steady clarity that had been building in her all year without her fully recognizing its shape until this moment. Her grandfather had waited 40 years for the right person to come looking. She had spent 3 weeks counting stones in a frozen pasture before she understood she was that person. She sat with the box a long while that night. The fire burned low, the polished fossil stone warm now from the heat of her own palm, and did not call anyone, not Louise, not Silas, because this particular truth belonged for one evening at least only to her and to the man who had left it waiting. The new year arrived quiet and cold, and with it came the resolution Silas had been chasing since the anonymous complaint first landed on the Planning Commission's desk. He called on the second Monday of January, his voice carrying a controlled edge of vindication that Verna recognized immediately, having heard something similar in her own voice the morning she'd walked into First Trust Farmers Bank with a cashier's check in hand. "I found it," he said. "The complaint, where it actually came from. Tell me." Bluegrass Aggregate and Stone. Ohio company does commercial quarrying work across 3 states. Turns out they bid on the same Louisville restoration contract. Marcus Delaney's project ultimately went with lost it because Marcus specifically wanted heritage-grade Kentucky limestone with documented provenance, something Bluegrass Aggregate can't offer because they work modern industrial quarries, not old farmland deposits like ours. Silas exhaled slowly. A former employee of theirs works for a competitor, now confirmed off the record that Bluegrass filed a formal complaint against us with the state, then followed it with the anonymous one to the County Planning Commission, hoping to tie us up in regulatory trouble long enough to make Marcus nervous and pull his contract elsewhere. They tried to bury us to win a bid they'd already lost. That's about the shape of it, yes. Verna sat with that for a long moment, feeling something settle into place that had been unsettled since the sleet-soaked afternoon outside the courthouse in December. Not Garrett Voss, whatever his other faults. Not anyone in Hollis County at all. A company 2 states away, threatened by nothing more than an old woman's stubbornness and a mason's honest work, willing to use bureaucracy as a weapon rather than face fair competition. Does this change anything with the state? I've already filed a formal response with documentation. It won't undo the hearing, but it puts the complaint on record as motivated by a business rival rather than any legitimate concern. Dabney Wexler already cleared our permits in December. This just makes sure nobody tries the same trick again. She thanked him, hung up the phone, and looked out at her North Pasture, snow-covered now, the extraction site quiet beneath a thin white blanket, and felt for the first time since the foreclosure notice had arrived nearly a year before, something that resembled not just relief, but earned confidence, the kind that comes only after a thing has been tested and found solid. Marcus Delaney called the following week to confirm the full contract terms, and this time Verna sat at her own kitchen table to negotiate, rather than simply reviewing what Silas and Louise's lawyer friend put in front of her. 200 tons over 18 months, guaranteed minimum pricing adjusted upward if market demand for heritage stone continued its current climb, which every indication suggested it would. A option written into the contract at Verna's own insistence for renewal into a second phase, if his current residential project led, as he expected, to additional commissions requiring the same stone. "You've become quite the negotiator, Mrs. Ashworth," Marcus said, and she could hear even over the phone something like genuine respect in the observation. "I've had a good teacher," she answered, thinking of Silas, thinking of her grandfather's letter still sitting folded in the cedar box on her mantel, thinking of her own grandmother's voice, patient as stone, telling a young girl on a porch that the land gives you exactly what it wants to give you, and your job is only to see it. The operation grew steadily through late winter and into early spring. Verna hired Ivy Kenner Otis's daughter, fresh home from studying geology at Western Kentucky, with no local prospects, and a father who had admittedly done nothing to help her find any. Ivy knew rock the way Verna was only beginning to, and needed work badly enough to swallow whatever pride stood between her and taking a job on the farm her own father had mocked less than a year before. He's not happy about it, Ivy admitted her first week standing at the edge of the extraction site with a clipboard she was already filling with grading notes far more technical than anything Verna herself could produce. Says I'm giving credibility to something he still thinks is a stunt. Your father thought I was getting scammed, Verna said. I imagine admitting he was wrong is harder for some men than admitting almost anything else. He says you got lucky. Verna looked out across ground that had swallowed 3 generations of Ashworth ambition before finally in its own patient time giving something back. Luck is seeing what's in front of you when everyone else insists on calling it nothing, she said. Your job since you're here now is to help me see it even more clearly than I already do. By March, other landowners had begun quietly approaching Verna the way Nora Fentress had approached her at the co-op meeting months before, not with mockery now, but with careful curiosity. Rick Malone, whose 40 acres bordered her southern boundary, equally rocky, equally dismissed by every bank and every neighbor, for as long as anyone could remember, stopped her outside church one Sunday. Verna, I've been thinking about your situation, he said, turning his hat in his hands the way men in Hollis County did when they were working up to admitting they'd been wrong about something. Wondering if Mr. Cordell's crew might take a look at my North 40 sometime. See if there's anything worth testing. I'll give you his number, Rick. He nodded grateful in a way that required no further words and walked back to his truck, and Verna found herself smiling in a way that had nothing to do with vindication and everything to do with the particular satisfaction of watching a door she had forced open with her own stubborn hands begin slowly to swing wide enough for others to walk through it too. The article in the Louisville newspaper, when it finally ran in late March, only accelerated what had already begun. A reporter named Constance Farrell had heard about the operation through the Planning Commission hearing driven out to Hollis County on a gray Tuesday, spent the better part of a day walking the property with Verna and Silas both, and produced a feature piece that ran with the headline, Stone Farming Kentucky Widow Finds Fortune in What Others Called Waste. The phone did not stop ringing for a week after it ran. Other landowners with rocky, thin, useless-seeming ground, university extension agents wanting to discuss stone extraction as a legitimate alternative agricultural practice, a production company inquiring about a documentary on sustainable rural land use. Verna said yes to the extension agents because their interests seemed to genuinely serve other farmers facing exactly the situation she'd faced the previous winter. She said no to the documentary crew gently but firmly because some part of her understood that she had not done any of this to become a story told by strangers, only to save a farm her grandfather had built and her husband had loved, and her own stubborn refusal to quietly disappear had against every prediction preserved. It was Roland Pruitt who surprised her most in the end, though perhaps she should have anticipated it, given everything else that spring had already overturned. She saw him at the grocery store on a Thursday afternoon in April, both of them reaching for items on opposite sides of the same narrow aisle, and watched him hesitate the way a man hesitates when he has been carrying something heavier than groceries for longer than he cares to admit. Verna, he said, finally setting down whatever he'd been holding, I owe you an apology. For what exactly? For more than I probably realize myself. He rubbed a hand across his face, and she saw for the first time since she'd known him something genuinely uncertain in his expression, the particular vulnerability of a confident man forced to reckon with having been wrong. The soil survey the bank used. I want you to know I actually saw the full geological report before I ever called you about foreclosure. There was a note in it buried in the technical language about limestone quality in the northern pastures. I didn't flag it for you. I told myself it wasn't my job to interpret geology for a client, that my job was only the numbers on the mortgage. He paused. But the truth is, Verna, I'd already mentioned that survey informally to a land developer I know in Lexington, someone who buys distressed agricultural property cheap and holds it for resale. If you'd walked away from that farm the way I told you to, I believe that same developer would have been first in line to buy it from the bank at foreclosure auction, likely for a fraction of what it was actually worth. The grocery store's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and somewhere behind them a cartwheel squeaked its way down another aisle, and Verna stood very still, feeling something complicated move through her. Not quite anger, not quite forgiveness. Something suspended in the careful space between the two. "You knew," she said quietly. "Not just that the land might be worth something. You knew, and you steered me toward losing it anyway." I told myself I was doing my job. I've spent the winter telling myself that, less and less convincingly. He looked at her directly now, no longer hiding behind professional distance. "I was wrong about the land, Verna. I was wrong about you. And I think if I'm honest with myself, I was more interested in an easy foreclosure that benefited someone I knew than in doing the harder work of actually helping a widow keep what her family had built." She could have let him carry that shame a long time, could have walked away without offering him any relief from it, and some hard, tired part of her wanted to. But she thought of her grandmother rocking on the porch all those years ago, telling her that vindication was never about making someone else suffer, only about proving quietly and completely what had been true all along. "You saw numbers rolling," she said finally. "I saw stone. We were both looking at the same land, and only one of us was honest about what we found there." He nodded slowly, something loosening in his shoulders that had clearly been tight for months. "If you ever need banking services again, Verna, I hope you'll let me be the first person you call." "We'll see," she said, and left it there because some doors deserve to stay only partway open, at least for a while longer. Garrett Voss's reckoning came differently and took longer, and arrived from a direction Verna had not expected. She heard about it first from Nora Fentress, who mentioned at the May co-op meeting, almost in passing, that a survey crew had been out at the Voss property the week before testing a rock outcropping along his eastern fence line that Garrett had spent 30 years farming around and cursing in roughly equal measure. "It turns out his ground isn't so different from yours after all." Nora said, something knowing in her expression. "Same formation near as the survey can tell. Same age, same fossil density." Verna absorbed this quietly, unsurprised, in a way that surprised her because she had begun to understand over the past year that Hollis County's stubborn rocky ground did not respect property lines any more than the 450 million years of ancient ocean that had laid it down in the first place. Garrett came to find her himself 3 weeks later, standing at her fence line on a warm June evening with his hat in his hands, looking older than she remembered him looking at the co-op meeting the previous autumn, though it had been less than a year since that confrontation. "I had my land surveyed," he said, without preamble, the way men sometimes spoke when they'd rehearsed an apology so many times in their own head that the actual delivery came out flatter than they intended. "Same limestone as yours." Cordell's people confirmed it themselves. "I heard. I owe you an apology, Verna, for the co-op meeting, for the things I said." He turned his hat over once, twice in his rough hands. "Truth is, I lost my own family's North 40 back in 1992. My father sold mineral rights to a company that promised him the moon took his stone practically for free, and by the time we understood how badly he'd been cheated, the money was gone, and the land was stripped and worth less than before they'd ever touched it. I watched my father age 10 years and 18 months over that deal. I swore I'd never let anybody talk me or anybody I cared about into something like that again." He looked up at her finally, something raw in his expression. "When I saw Cordell's truck on your land, I didn't see opportunity. I saw my father's mistake happening all over again to somebody who couldn't afford to make it. I was trying to protect you, even if it came out sounding like something uglier than that." Verna felt something shift in her chest, the same shift she'd felt at the co-op meeting itself when she'd first sensed that Garrett's anger belonged to something older and heavier than her own stones. "You could have told me that instead of calling me a fraud in front of the whole county," she said, though gently now, without the edge the words might have carried a year before. "I know. I'm sorry for that, too." He hesitated. "Would you consider connecting me with Cordell for my own land? I mean, if what happened to you can happen honestly the way you've done it, maybe it's not too late for my family's ground either." She looked at him a long moment, this man who had once stood in a parking lot, accusing her of making real farmers look bad, now standing at her fence line, asking humbly for the same chance she had fought so hard to claim for herself. "I'll give you his number," she said. "And Garrett, I'm sorry about your father. That kind of loss doesn't heal just because somebody else finds a way to avoid it." He nodded, something loosening in his face that looked almost like the beginning of peace, and walked back toward his truck through grass gone gold in the long June evening light, and Verna stood at her fence line a while longer watching him go, feeling the particular weight of a grudge finally fully released on both sides. Summer brought its own quiet triumphs, smaller than the contracts and the hearings, but no less meaningful to Verna as she watched them unfold. Ivy Kenner brought on 2 more hires by July, the operation now employing 8 people full-time, where less than a year before the same 42 acres had employed no one at all, beyond Verna's own increasingly desperate hands. The extraction map Silas had drawn now covered nearly the entire property in careful color-coded sections, each one graded, each one scheduled for careful patient removal over the years ahead. The northeast corner near the tree line marked permanently off-limits, a small, humble monument to the one mistake the operation had made and corrected honestly rather than hidden. Junie Cordell turned 14 that summer and spent much of it exactly where she'd spent the previous autumn, wandering the extraction site with her father's old tablet, photographing fossil patterns, filling notebooks with sketches that had grown in the space of a single year, remarkably more sophisticated. She'd started talking about architecture school with the specific, stubborn certainty of a child who has found early exactly what she means to do with her life. And Verna found herself more than once that summer watching the girl work with something like the same tenderness she'd once reserved for watching her own daughter grow up on this same land. You know, Silas told her one August afternoon watching his daughter crouch over a newly split block near the road. She's already talking about using your stone for a design project, some kind of competition entry for high schoolers sponsored by a preservation society in Louisville. Wants to design a small memorial structure, says the stone itself should be the whole point, not just the material. What kind of memorial? Silas hesitated, glancing toward his daughter before answering. She won't tell me exactly. Says it's still forming. But I think knowing her, it's got something to do with your grandfather's letter. She asked me about it more than once since you told her the story. Verna felt something warm move through her at that unexpected and entirely welcome sense of a story that had begun in a locked cedar box, now traveling forward into a 14-year-old girl's imagination, carrying itself unbidden into a future none of them could have predicted, the frozen morning Verna first walked out to count stones. The Ashworth Farms transformation by autumn had become simply the way things were in Hollis County, no longer news, no longer scandal, no longer the subject of feed store mockery or co-op meeting condemnation, but instead something closer to ordinary local pride, the kind reserved for a hometown business that had proven itself over a full turning of seasons. Verna herself had changed too, though she recognized the change only in fragments glimpsed sideways, the way a woman sometimes catches her own reflection in a window, and is surprised briefly by how much older or steadier or more herself she has become without quite noticing the transition happen. She thought often that autumn of the 4 carved words on her grandfather's cedar box, "The stones remember boy." She understood now more fully than she had the frozen afternoon she first found the box in the barn, that her grandfather had not simply been speaking about geology. He had been speaking about patience, about the particular kind of faith required to trust that something true and valuable, once recognized honestly, would eventually find the person capable of receiving it, even if that recognition took 40 years and required in the end a granddaughter he never lived to meet as an adult. October marked 1 full year since Roland Pruitt's first call about foreclosure, and Verna spent the anniversary quietly walking the north pasture alone. In the early morning, the way she had walked it that frozen spring, counting stones, though the ground beneath her feet now told a story entirely different from the one she'd feared then. Extraction scars healed now into careful terraced sections, equipment sheds where wild grass had once grown untended, a processing area near the road that had over 12 months become as familiar to her as her own kitchen. She stopped near the fence line, the same section where Junie Cordell had first found her grandfather's tool marks, and stood a long while in the cold morning air, feeling the particular satisfaction of having survived a year that had at various points threatened to take everything from her, and had instead, through nothing but stubbornness and the honest labor of people willing to see what others dismissed, given her back more than she had ever imagined possible. The 4-part resolution of that year, when Verna allowed herself to think of it as a whole rather than as a series of separate crises, survived one at a time, arrived not as a single dramatic climax, but as a slow accumulation of smaller endings, each one settling into place like a stone finding its natural seam. The first came in November when Marcus Delaney's residential project reached completion. 20 custom homes outside Lexington, finished with Hollis County heritage limestone facades that architectural critics in the regional press described in terms Verna clipped and kept in a scrapbook she had never before imagined owning as some of the finest stonework built in the state in a generation. Marcus called personally to invite her to the unveiling, and she stood at the edge of a manicured Lexington lawn in her good coat, looking at houses built from stone that had once lain scattered and cursed across her own north pasture, and felt something close to disbelief settle finally fully into something closer to simple pride. The second came quietly, almost privately, when Roland Pruitt called in December, not about banking, but simply to ask how the operation was faring as the year drew to a close. And Verna found herself answering him honestly, warmly, even understanding that some wrongs once acknowledged fully, and without defensiveness, could be allowed to heal into something resembling, if not friendship, at least mutual respect. The third came in the form of a phone call from Garrett Voss in January, informing her that Silas Cordell's crew had begun extraction on his own eastern acreage, the first shipment already contracted to a Nashville buyer, and that he wanted her to know specifically that none of it would have happened if she hadn't refused to accept what everyone, including himself, had once insisted was true about ground like theirs. And the fourth came in March, nearly 18 months after Verna had first walked out into a frozen pasture with nothing but a measuring tape and a stubborn refusal to disappear. When Junie Cordell, now 15, presented her design competition entry at a Preservation Society gala in Louisville, a small memorial pavilion built from Hollis County limestone, its design incorporating, at Junie's specific and deliberate insistence, a fossil pattern traced directly from a stone Verna herself had once helped catalog in her own North Pasture. The judges awarded it first place in its category. The accompanying placard, which Junie had written herself and shown to no one until the unveiling, read simply, "For Elias Ashworth, who saw what others couldn't, and for the granddaughter who finally listened." Verna read those words standing in a gallery full of strangers, Louise beside her, Silas and his family nearby, and felt something complete itself inside her that had been unfinished since the morning she'd first found her grandfather's box behind a dusty horse blanket in a cold equipment barn. She drove home that night with Louise beside her, the Kentucky darkness rolling past the windows in familiar comforting shapes, and said little the whole way, though her daughter seemed to understand without needing explanation that some silences carried more than any words could hold. When she finally reached her own gravel drive well past midnight, she did not go straight inside. She walked instead out to the porch, wrapped in her husband's old canvas coat that still faintly, after all this time, carried some trace memory of him. If she pressed her face just right into the collar and sat down in the same chair her grandmother Opal had once rocked in decades before, telling a young girl stories about stonemasons and forgotten trades, and the particular patience required to see value where others saw only obstacle. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered thick and bright above the pasture that stretched dark and silent behind the house, 42 acres that had once been called the worst farmland in 3 generations, and had become, through nothing more dramatic than one stubborn woman's refusal to look away, something closer to a legacy. She thought of her grandfather, 40 years of silent knowledge locked away in a cedar box, waiting patiently for someone with the right kind of eyes to finally come looking. She thought of Everett, gone 2 years now, but never entirely absent from this land he'd loved, even while calling it with wry affection the field God forgot to finish. She thought of Silas Cordell's steady, careful hands, of Junie's fierce young imagination, of Garrett Voss's healed grudge, of Roland Pruitt's quiet apology, of an entire county that had spent a year learning slowly and sometimes reluctantly to see what she herself had only just learned to see clearly enough to save. The mortgage was paid, the kitchen was warm, the land stretched out behind her house in the darkness, like a promise finally kept in full. She spoke her grandmother's words aloud into the cold night air quietly, the way a woman speaks a prayer she has carried so long it no longer needs an audience beyond herself and the ground she stands on. "The land provides what it provides," she whispered. "Our job is only to see it." Somewhere out in the darkness beneath frost, already beginning to settle over stone that had waited 450 million years for exactly this kind of recognition, the North Pasture held its silence the way it always had, patient, ancient, and finally, after so long, entirely at peace. Tomorrow, Silas Cordell's crew would return, as they had returned nearly every week for the better part of 2 years now. The extraction would continue. The stones would keep emerging from ground that had once been dismissed as worthless, carried away to build homes and walls and memorials that would stand if the stone held true to its own ancient nature for centuries longer than anyone currently living would ever see. But tonight, for the first time and longer than she could easily remember, Verna Ashworth simply sat on her own porch in the cold and the quiet, wrapped in her husband's old coat, surrounded by a legacy her grandfather had trusted her across 40 years and 2 generations to finally uncover. And when she finally rose to go inside, leaving the stars and the silent fields behind her, she did not look back at the darkness the way a frightened woman looks back at what she fears might follow her. She looked back the way a woman looks at something she has finally fully earned the right to call home.